Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
But we begin with a story that I would like to think everybody will be angry about, but unfortunately, history suggests that things don't work out like that. Mark Zuckerberg, the head of Facebook, has defended Holocaust denial. Sort of. He's defended Facebook users' right to be wrong. I find it fascinating because I don't think it happened when I was younger. I think it's only started happening in recent years, and I think it's probably linked to social media. If you look at the role that social media has played in, for example, delivering the Brexit vote and the Trump vote after epic manipulation of people who'd been identified as susceptible to racist propaganda, and then they spent hundreds of thousands of pounds and dollars bombarding them with racist propaganda, you realise that it is not a platform that fits into any previous definitions of platforms. And I know this possibly sounds a little bit trite, but I do think it's important to reiterate. The law takes a while to catch up with technology. You know, in fact, you could argue that a lot of so-called disruptive technologies are specifically designed to get ahead of the law and to use even something as banal as a payday loan company. You know, they just made shed loads of money as quickly as they possibly could because of internet technology, because of the ease with which you could borrow a bunch of money you couldn't afford to repay in the privacy of your own bedroom after getting in after a skinful on a Saturday night and realising you didn't have enough money to get to work on Monday morning. So the technology allowed immoral people to make a shed load of money, and then the law caught up with it, or then at least the government, politics caught up with technology. And I wonder whether Facebook is the mothership of this sort of phenomenon, whether Facebook actually, partly by accident and partly by design, has just run ahead of legislation, run ahead of the law, run ahead of policing, if you like, of such matters, which is how it could be used by, again, immoral people to pursue their own aims, whether political or financial, by disseminating lies and propaganda on an unprecedented scale. Millions of people. And the story yesterday that, again, doesn't get anything like the attention you might expect. The story yesterday confirmed that some of the data that had been harvested for Cambridge Analytica by that academic at Cambridge who didn't really know what he was doing, he was a bit of a geek who just loved the kind of coding challenge, as it were, was accessed from Russia. So, I mean, literally, you have data that delivers, well, this person's liked a Britain First article, they're probably going to be susceptible to some more racist propaganda. You send them a picture of some Syrian refugees, link it to the European Union, they'll go out and vote Brexit. This is actually how it worked. It's not a theory, it's not an opinion. I appreciate nobody actually recognises that they're one of the people that got done by racist propaganda, but it's quite easy to prove that you are. I just go to your Facebook page, have a look at what you've liked and shared. And if it contains racist propaganda, or even that Breaking Point poster, which was racist propaganda, then you got done. You got suckered. You somehow were persuaded that Syrian children drowning in the Mediterranean constituted a reason for you to vote not to be in the European Union. Geniuses, every single one of you. And then you come to the story today. This is, yet again, there is never before in the history of gobs on sticks has anyone enjoyed being proved right less than I currently am. But I told the New Statesman in February of 2017 that I feared the next issue to be viewed through the lens of false equivalence and balance would be Holocaust denial. February 2017, and I said to them, if that is what happens next, I haven't alerted Ivan to the fact that we're going to need a bleep, so I'll have to improvise my own bleep at this point. I said specifically to the New Statesman in February 2017, if Holocaust denial is the next thing that gets put through the lens of false equivalence and false balance, then we are all bleeped. And what's happened today? Arguably the most prevalent, the most accessible, what do you call Facebook? This is my point about the law lagging behind the technology. Do you call it a media company? Is it a publisher? No one is paid by Facebook to write journalism, and yet it is probably the source of more quotes, journalism, end quotes, than anything else the average individual can access on a daily basis. And you know, the top 50 stories shared on Facebook in the run-up to the election of Donald Trump were untrue. They were fake news, and now we know who was sponsoring it, and we're beginning to work out why. Astonishing exchanges on Russian state television last night, where one host effectively said that Donald Trump smells like an agent of the Kremlin. That's on Russian state television. Ah, happy days. So what happened the other day in an interview that Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook, gave was he essentially defended Holocaust denial posts on Facebook, saying that he didn't think that they're intentionally getting it wrong. And this frightens the bejesus out of me, because I think I know why people deny the Holocaust. If you lean towards far-right politics, the point at which, if you have an even vaguely functioning intellect, or indeed conscience, is the point at which other people point out this kind of identity politics, this kind of rhetoric, this kind of attitude to others, to immigrants, to Muslims, or to Jews, or to Roma, or to homosexuals, or disabled people. This kind of politics leads to holocausts. So I think it becomes beholden upon far-right rhetoricians and politicians at some point to start denying the Holocaust, because the existence, the reality, the history of the Holocaust is the biggest break available on far-right rhetoric and far-right politics. So if you were a fan of far-right politics, you would also be, arguably, a fan of Holocaust denial, because you get to deny the existence of the break. And if you can deny the existence of the break, then, of course, you can stop the break being applied. I think I understand that, but I am, as ever on this kind of issue, open to persuasion from you. I then move into the arguably choppier waters of freedoms. So what I'd like you to do, and some people will know a lot more about this than I do, is tell me why Holocaust denial is illegal in some countries. Okay? Because what Facebook appear to be doing is allowing these posts to be accessed in countries where there aren't any legal problems, but miraculously they don't appear on pages in countries where Facebook could end up being sued or prosecuted. That, to me, is a dereliction of duty, moral duty, on the part of Facebook that is almost inconceivable in its scale. Holocaust denial is illegal in various territories for reasons that we will examine together today. Facebook employs its technological clout to ensure that Holocaust denial simply doesn't pop up on the pages in the countries where it's illegal. There's no moral exercise there at all. And this weird fetishization of business that right-wing commentators and politicians undertake, because Mark Zuckerberg is good at coding and making money, he must somehow have talents that leach into other areas of life. It's insane. You know, it's absolutely nuts. It's a bit like thinking that because that fella from Wetherspoons is good at selling cheap beer, we should listen to his views on international trade and Brexit. It's nuts, absolutely nuts. But what you have now is Mark Zuckerberg effectively saying that we will allow Holocaust denial on Facebook because these people aren't lying, they're just mistaken. Give me a quick call, tell me how you feel about that. 03456060973 is the number to call. Have a beginning, because I think we do need, increasingly, we need to start at the very start. We need idiot's guides to these issues. So why is Holocaust denial illegal in, for example, Germany? 03456060973. Why is it illegal? That seems to me to be the starting point. And then I'd love you to tell me whether you think that platforms like Facebook and YouTube should be hosting, publishing. Can they abnegate responsibility in this way? Can they actually say it's not our responsibility to decide what can and can't be published? Or all that polices that question is the law of the relevant land. So if it's illegal to publish this stuff in that country, we won't. But if it's not illegal to publish it in this country, we will. I don't know the answer to this question. I know my opinion. My opinion is that this is despicable and frightening. But that is only my opinion. Your opinion may be more powerful than mine, more evidence-based. You may be able to explain why there is no clear answer to the question, or no clear case to be made, saying Facebook should not post this stuff. And it's not just Holocaust denial. You also have the InfoWars character, Alex Jones, who, of course, claims that the Sandy Hook mass shooting that left 20 school children dead, he claims it was a hoax. So Zuckerberg says going to someone who is a victim of Sandy Hook and telling them, hey, no, you're a liar, that is harassment, and we will actually take that down. But they won't take down a non-specific post saying they are all liars. And that, again, seems to me to be a dereliction of duty. It's, in the first instance, it's a little bit comforting to think that the laws haven't caught up with technology yet. But there's not a lot of comfort to be derived by the second line of this observation, which is what's going to happen before the law catches up with the technology. So how many people's lives were ruined by their payday loans before the government actually recognised that this had got away? This one had got halfway around the world before lawmakers had got out of bed. There's a lot to get through here, and I don't know whether any of it will draw in conversations based on Labour's anti-Semitism problems, or indeed on the Knesset's decision to afford self-determination only to Jewish people. They're two stories that seem to have a degree of relevance, but for me it's bigger and broader than those specific stories. It's about the question simply of whether or not Facebook should have an absolute moratorium and ban on all Holocaust denial. I'm 99.9% persuaded that it absolutely should. This rubbish, this disgusting grave dancing should not be permitted in any circumstances at all. It's demonstrably untrue, Holocaust denial. And yet, of course, a million things increasingly that are quite demonstrably untrue are in the era of alternative facts, fake news and Donald Trump. Well, you know. That would, of course, now means wouldn't. I find Holocaust denial repugnant, but falsity and repugnance cannot be sufficient conditions for censorship in a free society. I think they can, although this texter asks, where do you draw the line and who polices it? Well, I'm going to apply to police it if things don't improve soon. If the grown-ups don't come over the hills in the coming days, then I'm going to have to start policing this stuff. And there are Republican Holocaust deniers, Ann tells us, running in US elections right now. They're campaigning on it. This is true. I don't know how many there are, and I don't know at what level of American politics they're engaging, but there are, you're right, a couple. And that's where we're going with this. What should the laws be? What should the rules be? And I mean, you can be personal about Mark Zuckerberg if you want as well, because I think he's an absolute disgrace. Seeking to justify publication of lies about the parents of dead children at Sandy Hook, and similarly going along with the publication of Holocaust denial on the grounds that the people doing it are not intentionally getting it wrong. James is in Barnes. James, what would you like to say?
Yes, hi. James, I wanted to sort of somehow, if it's possible, link the three things that you spoke about, Corbyn, Israel and denial. And I think the first thing, the reason Germany is sacrosanct in Germany's law about denying the Holocaust is because Germany recognises it is the most shameful thing that has ever happened in the modern human world that we know. And that's why it's sacrosanct in German law that it's against the law to deny it, quite rightly. And it should be all over the world. I think some things do not allow for free speech.
I mean, without sounding ungrateful, I know that bit. But the question, and other countries where it is illegal, the alphabetical order is astonishing. Starts with Australia, ends with Switzerland, with 20-odd countries in between. But I mean, that's the what. You've given us the what. The why. Why is Holocaust denial so insidious?
It's a difficult answer. But
so you've rung in with the easy one, have you, James in Barnes?
Yeah, I think it is. Do you know what? It's such a difficult thing to answer that. I believe. Clearly
thought you were phoning a more traditional radio phone in.
I'm phoning more to link it to the whole thing with Israel at the moment and Corbyn in a way.
Yeah, I don't know if I want to go down that road yet, because I mean, for me, what you need to be able to explain to Mark Zuckerberg is why this isn't like other issues of equivalence or balance.
You would have thought you could explain it to Mark Zuckerberg because he is a Jew.
Well, obviously you can't, because he says he's going to leave them up because he didn't think the people putting them there were intentionally getting it wrong.
Yeah, which is the Trumpism, isn't it? If ever
I
there
think
was
it is.
one.
Yes, I think it is.
It's a complete Trumpism, and the question is, should governments, and I think they should, ensure, even if they have to go to a court, because they may not have it in their constitution or in their statute, to ensure that Facebook remove those.
But again, I mean, we're doing what's not wise. I mean, with love and respect, I want to get the absolute gold standard definition of why it should be illegal. Not.
Well, it should be illegal because why should it be illegal?
It's not illegal to tell other lies. I mean, what other lies are illegal?
Because it should be illegal, because if we take it out of the context of all other lies, and we know that it's the truth, you and me, having...
Yeah, but I'm not taking it out of the context of all other lies. That's the whole point of my question.
But it's because it's not like other crimes that have been committed. It is manifestly one of the most disturbing, horrific events that took place.
It's just a question of scale, then, not principle. I'm looking for a principle. A principle, because you can say because it's unique, is the opposite of what I'm looking for. It might well be the only answer we end up with, but it is... It's not a principle that you describe. It's an exception to a rule. The rule is usually that you're allowed to lie, just as then we would be allowed to respond by calling you a liar. This is different, and I agree with your feelings. It feels like it should be different. I just want to pin down why. And looking at it more from the Facebook angle than some of the broader issues, perhaps. So is it illegal in Russia? I think it might be. David is in Hampstead. David, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I think it's a very interesting point. I mean, I myself, I'm a religious Jew.
Yes.
And I think growing up in this country all my life, I think what really comes down to having experienced, anti-Semitism, for example, on both sides, where they kind of quote the Holocaust as this sort of spear to stab you with, it's the intent behind it. And I think really that's what it comes down to. Because if somebody wants to ask questions about the Holocaust, for example, they want to question things about the Holocaust in specific details, that's fine. That's historical. That's what academics do. But I think, my grandfather's a Holocaust survivor, and I think somebody who says the Holocaust didn't happen or however they want to deny it, they're really denying whether it's someone like my grandfather who survived it or someone like me who's a descendant. They're really denying your rights of sort of your identity. Not that it identifies me. I identify myself as more than that.
No, I understand, but it's a crucial part of your history, and your history is a crucial part of you.
Yeah, and I think it'd be the different. It is if someone would say to you, for example, your grandfather or your parent or whoever it might be. Yeah, they're not allowed to identify as wherever they come from, be it here or be it.
Why? So I'm just going to be one of those days where I just say why to people, like a 5-year-old talking to his dad. Why, David? Why? Why is it so important that you can't deny you these truths?
Because ultimately what you're then doing, I say it comes down to the intent. It's someone's
the motive.
It's part of and it's part of their identity.
So what is the motive? What is the motive of Holocaust denial? And there isn't going to be a single answer to that question, but just give me the biggest.
Okay, so from my experience growing up, I went to a primary school that was in an area of North London. We used to get bricks thrown through the window sporadically, and people tended to shout what I would describe as, I wouldn't say Holocaust denial, they weren't that clever, but it tended to be, maybe call it Nazi kind of things, all those kind of stereotypical things.
But that, in a way, that could be construed as the opposite of Holocaust denial. I'm not being pedantic. I mean, there are people saying, I'm glad they gassed the Jews, which, we hear, of course, reports from Dulwich College in the 1970s of one prominent former pupil marching around the place saying, gas the Jews, gas the Jews, gas the Jews. That's the opposite of Holocaust denial. That's saying, I'm glad it happened.
It develops, and that's where the intent comes in. So I, progressed through my education. I went to university here in London, and then it progresses into the kind of academic Holocaust denial. So no longer are they a knuckle-dragging skinhead.
No.
They're now an academic.
And what's the motive there?
So the motive there is, I would say it's somewhere between dehumanization and really a superiority thing, because they're saying, I can say that it didn't happen, and here's my strange evidence. It's not really evidence, but it's something that's quite convincing.
Yeah, but that's more than, because you're almost chalking it up as academic vanity, and it has to be more evil than that.
I think it develops. I think you get the kind of the stupid spectrum of people who simply say, I hate Jews, so therefore I'm going to try and annoy them by telling them this didn't happen. And then you have the other people who put a bit more thought behind it, but the intent's the same. The intent is to dehumanize, and the intent is to really deny a right of self-determination as a Jew.
Yes. I'm not sure I agree with you, but only in the sense that I asked for the biggest reason, and you've given me one that is probably a reason. But for me, the biggest reason is an attempt to put the brakes on the idea that far-right rhetoric leads to Holocaust?
I think it is. And I think, as well as that, I think it comes down to, people who tend to say things that are Holocaust denial, they tend to really, ultimately they're racist. And it's the same as if I denied, for example, a black community from a particular part of the world, denied them their heritage and their history because I said, no, do you know what, that didn't happen. It's the same kind of thing. And when it comes to the Holocaust, what it tends to then boil down to is this kind of discriminatory view whereby Jews are inferior, but then they also run the world. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to get them right down the middle, and I'm going to find that event where all of them, regardless of whether I believe they were the inferior Jews or the superior Jews, were rounded up and killed. So I'm going to use that, and I'm going to hit you with that. Yeah. So I think that's really what it comes down to.
Yeah, there's definitely something in that. Can we think of anything else in the context of publication that stands comparison with Holocaust denial?
I think in terms of scale, fortunately or unfortunately, as you look at it, probably not.
Because there's no such thing as slavery denial, is there? You get the because for me, slavery is a Holocaust of a different flavour. But you get the attempts to say, well, Irish people were in. You get the attempts to de-race slavery, which are pathetic and they don't stand up to academic scrutiny. But you wouldn't ban them in the same way that you would ban Holocaust denial.
Yeah, you wouldn't. And I think the reason is, I think if slavery denial was a thing, and I think if slavery denial then took people down a very dangerous path, as I say, I had people shouting at my primary school things about Hitler and gassing Jews and all sorts of things. If it led people down that path, then it should be looked at in exactly the same way. It just happens to be that I think most, sort of normal, sane people will say there's a particularly powerful, emotive side of things when it comes to the Holocaust, and it's used as this kind of sledgehammer to hit Jews and people affected by the Holocaust, which aren't only Jews, but it's used to hit them with because it's such a powerful, such an emotive thing.
And that's the thing that intellectually is quite difficult to process, actually. The fact that, because with the first caller, that insistence that you give me a principle. In fact, it may well be that there is a principle, but at this point in human history, it will only apply, arguably, to one instance, and that instance will be the Holocaust. So you could just about, I wouldn't personally, because I think Facebook should have some sort of editorial ethical code. I wouldn't allow Alex Jones on there to tell lies about the parents of the Sandy Hook children. But, Holocaust denial is on a different page completely to that sort of fake news, that sort of lie. It's 10:30. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. There's one line. Oh, no, it's gone. My apologies. I'm slightly surprised to find myself this morning bringing payday loan companies into a conversation about Holocaust denial. Regular listeners would probably be less surprised than people who've tuned in for the first time, but it really worked, didn't it? This notion that the technology is ahead of the law. So only when the law catches up with the technology do the public get served by politicians. In the case of payday loan companies, it was a kind of loophole created by technological advances that allowed serious amounts of money to be made in profoundly immoral and disgusting ways before the law caught up. And Facebook, I think, is similarly ahead of the law and ahead of regulations, not least because it's supranational. So in the countries where there are laws governing or forbidding, outlawing Holocaust denial, Facebook has the algorithms in place to make sure that Holocaust denial doesn't appear in the Facebook feeds of citizens. But in the countries where it's not illegal, Holocaust denial is rampant on Facebook. And where we are is essentially calling or expecting Facebook to voluntarily give up money. Because, the far right is a sewer, but it's a very, very big sewer on Facebook. And every time something gets shared or liked or looked at, there's a financial consequence, isn't there? Tiny, but it adds up. Millions and millions and millions of likes. It's all about advertising. So what you're saying to Facebook is, all right, this is pretty toxic stuff, but 2 million people have looked at that story claiming that the grieving parents of the Sandy Hook massacres are liars. 2 million times X equals, 2 million X, and that would be a voluntary surrender of revenue, a voluntary surrender of income. And almost everything that's wrong in the world at the moment, arguably, comes from this naive liberal idea that losers like me used to subscribe to, that eventually morality will impinge upon profiteering. Eventually, someone will turn around and say, well, we could make a lot of money doing that, but it would be wrong to do so. So voluntary surrendering of revenue. It's never going to happen, is it? Which is why I think Facebook needs to be hauled over the coals. But by whom? Whom? Who outlaws? I don't know. Dan's in Dorset. Dan, what would you like to say?
Good morning, how are you?
Hello, mate.
Yeah, I don't particularly want to see Holocaust denial completely censored, but I'm perfectly willing to be shut down on this, but I want my idiots where I can see them.
Yeah.
I don't want them to be banished to some little dark corner where they can chat amongst themselves, gather momentum, and then emerge. And in the meantime, I've forgotten how to have the argument.
It's an interesting point. It's an interesting point. I think that the example of Germany in the 1930s works against you because Incorrigible FCA reminds me in a tweet that they cited that the liberals in 1930s Germany would cite Voltaire, that slightly misattributed quote of Voltaire's about, "I defend to the death your right to say it." Do you know what I mean? I might hate what you say, but and Plato and Cicero. And I mean, I think a few years ago I would have agreed with you, but giving oxygen to racist liars doesn't seem to have worked. It seems to have created more people who believe racist liars than it does people like me and you who can easily win arguments with them.
Well, there is that, but then something you said earlier, touch back on something oddly that you and I spoke about on the phone about a year ago.
Go on.
Which is the bubbles created in social media.
Yes.
Which means I can't have the argument with them because I can't find them, and they can't find me because of such things as the algorithms that Facebook works upon.
But that's an argument in favour of closing them down, isn't it, rather than against closing them down?
I think it's an argument in favour of. Or against those bubbles.
Well, but Facebook gives them... I'm going to stretch your analogy to breaking point now. Facebook gives them the bubble liquid, doesn't it?
No, exactly. Facebook creates the bubbles.
But it gives them the tools with which to create their own bubbles.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing that needs to be removed, because that's where Brexit and Trump came from as well, those bubbles. And also the gap between technology and legislation that you were talking about.
That is going to be. I mean, that might be the subject of my next book, Dan. Actually, I think that could well be the subject of the next pontification. The gap. Although I'm not really qualified to do it, I don't know enough about technology. But yeah, I mean, he's right about Brexit and Trump. Most people I know didn't get bombarded during Facebook with pictures of beheadings in the Middle East being cited as what would happen in Kidderminster in the event of a vote to leave the European Union. But people who were susceptible to racist propaganda got bombarded with it, and you will occasionally seen some of it being shared. And to us, it would be an aberration. You go, what the hell is this? But to the people sharing it at the time, we now know it was all they were seeing. They were just being bombarded, deliberately targeted, specifically identified. If you look at when the Republicans cancelled a lot of their ad spend in the run-up to the American election campaign, knowing what we know now about Russian interference and dark money, and Cambridge Analytica and companies like that, it's astonishing to see the Russian hack, the email hacks, plus the data harvesting, plus the targeting of advertising, created a scenario in which the Republicans could look at their advertising plan and say, well, there's no point spending any of that. Let's stick it all on this. And they were directly addressing individuals with racist propaganda, having identified these individuals as susceptible. That's what Dan's talking about in the context of bubbles. How do you break those bubbles? But Holocaust denial is racist propaganda. So why does this racist propaganda have to be banned, but all the other stuff can still be allowed to breathe? I think you need some sort of regulator. But how are you going to regulate something that is supranational? Answer, you need international rules-based institutions. Question, why do you think so many powerful, nasty people are currently waging war on international rules-based institutions? From the Kremlin to the White House, to President Erdogan in Turkey. What is their problem with international rules-based institutions? Well, James, if you've got international rules-based institutions, a lie can't get halfway around the world before the truth has got its boots on. Adam's in Finchley. Adam, what would you like to say?
Morning, how you doing?
Pretty good, I think.
Good. I just wanted to go back and start from the caller from before the break.
Yes.
Made some set points, and it all makes sense. I'm also a Jew living in North London, and I went to the largest Jewish school in Europe there in North London, in Kingsbury. And for me, as a 14-year-old, my earliest memory interacting with other schools was going to a sort of a Brent meet-up for athletics, and walking through their school gates, all the other children from other schools were hissing, making the gas chamber noises and shouting, Jews, Jews, hissing. So it wasn't very good, and I've experienced a lot of anti-Semitism in my life, being spat on, etc., etc. And this all, I think, links back to why denying the Holocaust is illegal, in the sense that if you can get away with denying the pinnacle of Jewish sort of discrimination and hatred towards Jews,
Yes.
then you can sort of get away with all these other what seem like little things in comparison, they're not, and they go unpunished, and they do go unpunished, and that's why.
But they are. I think you're probably knocking on the door of definitive, but they're the opposites. Those disgusting noises that you were subjected to are the opposite of Holocaust denial. They are. I mean, this is a brutal phrase, but they're Holocaust celebration.
To be fair, I think they interlink.
Yeah, I do as well, but I can't quite see why. That's all I'm saying. Because they are, ostensibly, they're polar opposites. One is celebrating the Holocaust, the other is denying it, but both are perhaps designed to undermine the horror of it. Is that what they have in common?
I think so, but then also just because you can get... I think anti-Semitism has just been allowed to sort of grow uncontrolled, and so it's seen as okay, and then you're targeting a vulnerable group of society, which is why you see a violence towards sort of Jews in London and all over the country and the world increase, because you can just get away with it unpunished. I also think, I go back to your point where you said some people are sort of misinformed. That's why they're saying these things.
Well, this is Zuckerberg's defence. I think it's pretty fatuous myself, but...
So he said this, but I think sort of playing that card of, I don't know what I'm talking about, or I'm misinformed when you're denying things like the Holocaust. It's just something. It's a shield to hide behind your true feelings, which is anti-Semitism towards the Jews. That's what I feel, because you know the context of it. You know what's happened. You can't deny it with saying I'm misinformed, because you know what it's all about.
Well, do you know, to go even further, you'd say, all right, I can understand how people might believe this nonsense if it's all they've been exposed to, but why would anybody want to believe it in the first place? That seems to me to be the problem here.
Why would anyone want to believe the Holocaust, you mean? Or
no, why would anyone want to believe Holocaust denial? Even if you could make an intellectual case, as Zuckerberg's trying to do, for saying they don't realise how wrong they are, the appetite for believing in Holocaust denial is a pretty ugly impetus, isn't it?
But then you could go through history and see what's happened with the Jews, and you could say, why do they think it's okay for denial of the last massacre that happened? Or even when you go back to Mount Masada thousands of years ago when the Jews were murdered by other armies, you can say, why was that looked at as okay? It's just been built up through history. And
yes, but this is the difference. The difference between saying, essentially, the victims deserved it, which is disgusting, and then saying it didn't happen. And like you, I feel that there is a link between those two. It's almost as if they're two sides of the same coin, but I don't think either of us have quite managed to pin down precisely what that link is. It was interesting that Adam referred to, because he sounds rather younger than this, Dulwich College student who remembers one of his former classmates. I'll read it to you. This is what he wrote in 2016 in an open letter. But I do remember you singing the song starting with the words, gas them all, gas them all, gas them all. I can't forget the words. I can't bring myself to write the rest of it, for it is more vile than anything the teachers at Dulwich would ever have been aware of. And, of course, the man he's talking about will be on LBC at 7 o'clock tonight. We're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the question of why Holocaust denial is permitted by Facebook, and indeed why it shouldn't be, are both being answered. Not everybody agrees with the second statement. I mean, historically, it's civil rights advocates who contend that laws banning Holocaust denial violate freedom of speech and freedom of expression. But for me, at this point in the 21st century, looking back on events of 80 or so years ago, it still feels so utterly unprecedented isn't quite the right word, but it feels utterly at odds with any of the other examples. So you're not allowed to stand up in a crowded theatre and shout fire. You could get prosecuted for that, because you could cause a stampede and people could get killed as they made their way to the exits, and you had lied, so you'd created that tragedy. So there are always limits on freedom of speech. There is no such thing as unfettered freedom of speech unless you're alone and you're not governed by any laws or traditions or civilizations, and you're just screaming at the moon. But for the rest of us, once we start living alongside others, there are rules in place governing what we can and can't say to and about each other. So why is Holocaust denial still permitted? And why the hell is it still allowed on Facebook? And what on earth is Mark Zuckerberg playing at when he suggests that he doesn't want to take down the posts because he doesn't think the people putting them there are intentionally getting it wrong? I mean, theoretically, that means... Well, I mean, what about health stuff? What about stuff that says drinking poison will make you better? Would that get... I mean, because that, again, is freedom of speech, isn't it? Drinking petrol or get rid of your zits. I could say that out loud. It's utterly wrong. It could lead to somebody dying. But it's freedom of speech. Do you see what I mean? These things, the idea that it's a black and white issue is probably one of the daftest ideas out there. Astrid is in Ealing. Astrid, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Thank you. I have 3 stories to tell. One is because I'm German, every time I go into, I don't know, Arab country, at some point or other it'll come up. And I had a discussion, one in Lebanon, and a guy said to me, oh, you're German.
Whoa. No, Astrid, you just swore. So I have to dump... I know, I have to dump the call now. That's inexcusable. Why would you do that? We're having a serious conversation. That was a vile word that you just used.
Sorry. He said that to me, and I said, look, they killed 6 million Jews. And he said, no, they only killed 2 million. And I looked at him and I said, how can you say... only with the word 2 million, how would you even say it's possible? And he said, oh, no, I know that for a fact. And
what do you think? I'm cross with you for swearing, but I'm going to moderate my anger because you make such an interesting point. What motivated him, do you think? Why would he want to quibble over the scale of the tragedy? What's in it for him?
What he is saying is right, and I'll give you another example.
No, I know he believes it's right, but what's in it for him? Because it's a very odd thing to want to believe, let alone an odd thing to believe. Why would you want to believe it?
I don't think that he is wanting to believe something. I think the hatred between the Arab world and the Jewish world for war reasons and for many, many reasons has brought it to the point where... And this is where I want to give you the other story first. It was a 27-year-old guide, so a tourist guide, right? Not just anyone. And he said to me, oh, we love the Germans, I said, you can't say that. And then he said, oh, but Hitler didn't kill the German Jews, he only killed the Sephardic Jews. And I looked at him and I said, you are a guide, you're a tourist, how can you say that?
Yes.
And he said, I said, oh, is that not true? And I looked at him and I said, no, that's absolutely not true.
Well, then you've almost explained Zuckerberg's argument, haven't you? You've said he's not being intentionally wrong. He genuinely believes this.
No, but the worst thing comes now. He says, this is what we get taught in school. And it nearly threw me off because if a whole, youth class, a whole set of students is taught that is...
Well, then how do you legislate for Facebook then? This is Zuckerberg's defense. People believe it. They've been told it. You cite the possibility of them being told it by traditionally trustworthy sources. So to turn around and ban it won't make sense to these people, will it? Because they think they'll be banning you. They think you'll be banning the truth.
No, I think therefore you have to ban it because it is not the truth and because they have to learn that it is not the truth.
Yeah. Except that they will still believe that it's the truth. They just won't be seeing it repeated on Facebook. I mean, you'd have to take that right back into the classroom. Astrid, thank you. Next time you ring in, it will be soap, washing your mouth out with soap and water if that kind of language gets repeated. Ben's in Liverpool. Ben, what would you like to say?
Oh, James. I was really impressed by you making the point about there being no such thing as free speech. There's a really interesting book by an economist called Harjun Chen where he talks about the fact there's no such thing as the free market. And it's the same kind of lie where we say that this should be absolutely free, but an absolutely free market would mean you could buy and sell people or stolen goods. And it's the same with free speech. We do have limits on speech. There are libel laws. You can't say something that hurts somebody's business or reputation. And to me, so the measure with all of our freedoms is the freedom stops where you harm somebody else. There's a Sri Lankan friend of mine who taught me a phrase they have, which is, your freedom ends at the tip of my nose. And that's really what the standard should be. If we're looking for this, gold standard, as you put it, for... I've got the right to harm you, though, in some ways, haven't I? I mean, it's not what I'm saying, it's not a line in the sand. I could embarrass you in an argument, that would cause you harm. I could make you look stupid in public, that would cause you harm. I could call your mum fat. That would cause you harm. Do you see? I mean, it's not a simple line, but none of these things are simple. We have difficult discussions about every law that we pass, because every law limits freedom in some way or another. Like I say, one of the real sort of paradoxes at the heart of the debate about free speech is when people say, it's really important that we protect free speech and therefore we should be able to say anything. They say that because speech is powerful. Speech has the power to make really great things happen.
Of course it does.
It has the power to do terrible harm.
But what line are we going to write then? Because I quite like my petrol drinking analogy. Right, I would not be allowed to appear on the radio and tell people that if they drink petrol, it will cure their acne. So that freedom of speech in public, and Facebook is a public platform as well. Problem is, I probably could write that on Facebook, and it would have to be reported before it actually got taken down, wouldn't it? So the line would be, because that's a good example of your harm theory. We shall call it Ben's theory of harm to make it sound very academic. It sounds like John Rawls's theory of justice. Ben's theory of harm is such that if you are actively encouraging people to harm themselves, it's easy to police. But Holocaust denial doesn't encourage people to harm themselves. It denies a historical harm, which doesn't, I mean, in the first instance, it doesn't hurt anybody today. Not obviously.
In the first instance, but it forms part of the culture. We know, we've seen, hate speech like that that's been used by, various horrible groups.
Yes.
Starting with the Nazis themselves, well, not starting with, but that's certainly a big example. But up until today, a lot of the horrific things that Donald Trump is being able to do in power is because of the hate speech he used to rile up a base to get the political power he needed to do that. So it does...
But there's nothing, Joe, what could you have prevented Donald Trump from saying? He literally says on Monday that the moon is made of cheese, and then on Tuesday, I never meant the moon. When I said cheese, I meant moon rock.
Exactly, and this is the.
But I know. But what are we going to do about it? Because you've jumped around loads. We haven't written a rule that says these are the things that you're not allowed to put on Facebook. All we've written is Holocaust denial is the thing that you're not allowed to put on Facebook, and it may be, as we suggested half an hour ago, we end this hour concluding that it is unique, and that is why it needs unique protection. But at the moment, there's no principle here that could be applied to anything else.
Well, I would say it falls under the sort of the banner of hate speech against an oppressed minority, a racial minority. So speech which is racist, speech which is sexist, speech which is homophobic.
So that's not illegal. Incitement is illegal. Hatred is not.
I appreciate that, but we actually need to have a conversation about whether these things should be allowed when they can cause demonstrable harm, and we know that they can. We know that. But
lots of things can cause we're going around in circles. We're going around in circles together. It's not a criticism of you. It's my sort of slightly obsessive quest for a principle that could apply across the whole of Facebook, the whole of media, the whole of the world. And maybe the Holocaust is so vile, so vicious, so disgusting that it needs its own set of rules. I mean, Holocaust, they're like Mein Kampf being banned in Germany, unlike, I think, any other book, pretty much. Pete's in Windsor. Pete, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Yeah, I was just really interested because you were talking about lies and denial, and I was just thinking, like, from a teacher's perspective, I was saying that I think the thing is, why we can turn around and say, yes, this can be banned, sort of Holocaust denial, is because we've come to a kind of legal consensus that it took place. If, say,
yes,
a pupil is caught cheating in an exam. Or you suspect...
Yeah, but then I refer you straight to Sandy Hook. Hang on, I'm talking over you only because we're going to run out of time, because Facebook also allows InfoWars to tell lies about the Sandy Hook massacre and to accuse the grieving parents of somehow being hoaxers. So that's demonstrably untrue as well. So if you ban the Holocaust denial, you'd have to ban Alex Jones's ludicrous assaults upon grieving parents.
Well, I don't necessarily think... you're sort of saying banning. I think banning and sort of litigating against...
Banning from Facebook.
I think it's a little bit like, against like footballers swearing at referees in a sense, because, we're all saying it's terrible, 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 but no one's getting red carded. So if a footballer swore at the referee to get red carded, maybe footballers would stop swearing at referees. And if people got in trouble for doing these things, maybe they'd stop doing them.
You are. I mean, I'm comfortable conflating the Sandy Hook story with the Holocaust, actually, or with Holocaust denial, personally. You're right, I would give them both a red card. But you're suggesting that it then becomes self-censorship or self-policing, and the fear of the red card would stop people from doing things. You still have to carry on dishing out the red cards to everyone who hasn't been deterred from doing it, and that is a ban. I mean, you give someone a red card, you're banning them from playing football for the duration of the game. For me, in the context of these sort of things, you ban them from doing that particular foul forever. It's 11 o'clock. Thank you. Just a couple of tweets that have come in the course of the conversation we were having in the last hour about Holocaust, and I'm going to read them both to you, just by way of a punctuation mark before we move on to talk about something else. The first, remarkably similar, actually. Holocaust denial is beyond unbelievable, James. My father was one of the liberating troops, the liberating British troops at Belsen. I cannot even begin to comprehend what he would have thought. And a reply to that, coincidentally, my late father-in-law was also one of the liberating troops. Aged just 19, he never spoke of it, but would have continuous screaming nightmares throughout his life. Most of these soldiers are now dead, so where does our history come from if they couldn't share things? It is 5 minutes after 11. I've got a terrible frog in my throat, so I'll take a couple more calls on this issue. And then we'll move on to the... Well, what's becoming... One of my favourite subjects, actually, is what am I supposed to be cross about? It might even become a feature on the programme. Excuse me, I'm fine now. Tickly throat. The latest example is a few students with a pot of paint in Manchester, I think, covered a poem that was on the Student Union wall that had been written by Rudyard Kipling. It's one of my all-time favourite poems, actually. I used to be able to get pretty much all the way through it from memory. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. It's a beautiful, beautiful poem. And students are beautifully, beautifully idealistic and naive. And anyone who's ever spent more than 30 seconds in a university will know that students get a bit carried away sometimes. If I'm being patronising, that's probably because I am actually being patronising. As an older person who used to be a slightly idealistic student who used to get a bit carried away occasionally, the idea of a few students painting over a poem in a student union being such an epic story that it is currently the whole of page 31 in the Daily Mail is absolutely staggering to me. And I just want to work out what it is. And also the idea that what is it, half a dozen students probably responsible for this, even if it was 20 or 30 of them. The idea that half a dozen idealistic, slightly over-the-top Mancunian students on one side are hypersensitive snowflakes who need to get over themselves and learn about taking offence, and you can't be outraged, you can only take offence, you can't give it... Then on the other side, you've got grown men. The entire editorial staff of the Daily Mail, you've got grown men having absolute fits about the behaviour of 6 students with a pot of paint. Now, you tell me who the snowflake is here. This is why I find the story fascinating. Look, here's a poem I really like by an author who reflected an awful lot of quite commonplace 19th century sensibilities regarding colonialism and racial superiority and inferiority. You need to look at what he believed in order to explain how the world has progressed, but you don't hold him responsible for simply believing what everybody believed 150 years ago, or if not everybody, then most people. And then some students get a little bit get angry, and they think you should excise this man from our student union because he did endorse colonialism, and colonialism is wrong. Just ask Boris Johnson. And that's the end of the story. All right, you silly sausages. In a perfect universe, in an episode of Doctor Who somewhere, there are 6 students with a pot of paint covering over a poem, and then someone else comes in the next day and puts the poem back up, and then the day after that someone comes in and covers the poem over again, and the day after that someone comes in and puts the poem back up, and the day after that someone comes in and paints over the poem, and that just goes on ad infinitum, and both sides arguably are as silly as each other, although for my money the students painting over the poem are the sillier ones. But why the outrage? I've got a horrible theory on this, is that what these young people would be perceived as is virulently anti-racist, all right? I would say excessively anti-racist, exaggeratedly anti-racist, arguably even if you can be such a thing, too anti-racist, in that they're picking the wrong targets for their anti-racism. So if you are a racist, right, and you're not really allowed to say, well, I agree with Kipling, I think the blacks are an inferior race, and the best thing that ever happened to India was the empire. If you are of the view that somehow white supremacism is anything other than toxic nonsense, but you're not allowed to say that out loud, instead of taking your hatreds and your angers out on black people or Indian people, you take them out on the exaggeratedly, excessively anti-racist. So why on earth would anyone be cross with these students? Well, because they're standing up against racism. Yeah, but that's a good thing to do, isn't it? Yeah, it is a good thing. Well, obviously, I can't say that it isn't a good thing to do to stand up against racism. So I'll find some silly ones. This is what I'll do. I'll find some silly anti-racists who've done something a bit silly, and I'll go nuts about them, even though it's completely disproportionate and makes no sense whatsoever to anybody on the outside looking in, because I'm not really going nuts about the 6 students who are painting over a poem by Rudyard Kipling. I'm not really going nuts about them. They're not the reason why I'm having an embolism in my column today. What I'm really cross with is people who point out racism, like all of them, because sometimes they point out mine. that's what this story is really about. I don't know, just a theory. We'll examine it imminently. But first, 2 more calls on the question of Holocaust denial. Andre is in Bristol. Andre, what would you like to say?
Yeah, hi, James. Good work.
Thank you.
Listen, I grew up in 1970s Germany. I'm Czech, and so I grew up with this law, so I could see the effects of it, and I felt it was very positive. Because what the effect was, everybody knew about it, that Nazi sympathizers, who was obviously there, and some may have still been involved in the thing when I was there, they knew what they couldn't say. So, you know, they might say things like, I couldn't have been 6 million, you know, to me, you know, it's far too many people, and things like that. But they said them very quietly, and they just, the way I felt it worked, that law, was to restrict the seeds of evil. You know, it couldn't, before it sort of could spread out the way it can do on social media or, you know, in the big sphere, it was restricting it. And I felt it was, you know, didn't worry me at all, and I thought it was a very good thing.
What in your view, motivated the people that would have liked to deny it more publicly and more vocally? What's in it for them? I've asked a few people this question. I've got a variety of answers to it. I'd love to hear yours.
Well, you know, there were people who'd been involved in the evils, and obviously some of them had a good time. There was one guy said to me his best time he'd had when he was in Paris, you know, in the war. Well, obviously, you know, the champagne was flowing freely if you're a German officer, and the brothels were buzzing, I believe.
Right.
So the evil was it was accepted, you know.
Okay. That's that's a much more workaday answer, isn't it? A much more kind of normal, if you like, response. Why would you want to deny the Holocaust? Well, because I was a soldier in the Second World War. I had nothing to do with the Holocaust, but obviously I've got incredible amounts of blood on my hand. I'm a lot more comfortable chalking the Second World War up as a war that was fought along similar lines to the First World War, so it doesn't invoke national shame on an incredible scale, because I don't want to be feeling ashamed.
But what I like to say was, you know, everyone was aware of it, and I definitely felt it was a good thing, you know, because
I can't see a downside.
You know, you haven't lived with that law, so you can't really judge it. It's like somebody who grew up with it, and it kept almost like a sort of a baseline, like a sort of acceptance to some degree, which the Germans obviously had to deal with more than others.
Indeed, and I guess that, you know, even though the far right is on the rise again in Germany.
I feel very worried about the far right at the moment.
Beatrix von Storch.
You know, I talked to my grandfathers and about it, so I do feel really worrying times. And
yes, but things would accelerate perhaps even faster if these legislations, these laws, weren't in place, as it is the legitimisation of barefaced lies that has created the alt-right, that has created a lot of the movements that are now causing a lot of concern in a lot of corners of the world. That German party, of course, the AfD, deputy leader, granddaughter of Adolf Hitler's finance minister, and that is where Nigel Farage, of course, chose to speak at a rally just last year. 13 minutes after 11 is the time. Matthew is in High Wycombe. Matthew, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I'm going to make several points. So first of all, I would say Holocaust denial makes sense for Germans, and I'm not saying it's a good thing, but it makes sense for Germans because if you acknowledge, I mean, anyone who's watched The World at War and the series on the Holocaust, it's such an obvious, egregious harm and mass slaughter.
Yes.
And it makes you want to weep. If anyone's had children, you see the pictures, it makes you want to weep. But if your grandparents or your nation was involved in that, then for most people, shame is overwhelming, and so we don't want to acknowledge it. And I'm sure it's the same.
I don't think it's most people. Otherwise, the government wouldn't have banned it. I mean, the German sense of shame, everywhere you go in Germany, you see reminders of the Holocaust. You see public expressions of guilt and shame and sorrow. It's not. I mean, I take some of what you said, but there's no way it's most.
Sure. What I'm saying is for a lot of people, if you...
Yes, for a lot of people. That's what the last caller touched on. Yes.
Then you walk around feeling...
You get a free pass on the guilt if you deny that it happened.
Exactly. But what I would say is the reason why people, and this is partly brought up by one of your previous callers, but the reason why people outside Germany are so in love with Holocaust denial is it's the most obvious example of a mass murder that was planned by one group of people against another group of people. For years, Hitler said, this is my plan, this is what I'm going to do. The Jews are to blame. Then they had the conferences. This is how we're going to do it. Everything is minuted. Everything is documented. People are given numbers. They're put into camps. Again, the documentation, photographs by everybody.
Yes.
Millions of people get slaughtered. Everything gets documented. The liberators documented.
Yes.
Compared to other mass murders, it's a very clear warning sign of, listen, if we have totalitarianism or authoritarianism, this is the potential end point. And so for people who are in love with authoritarian ideas, denying the Holocaust means that they can deny the parallels between the other things that they are going to do, because it's such a clear and obvious red light to right-thinking people.
And
I would say that's
why
they want
neo-Nazis are at the vanguard of Holocaust denial. Matthew, brilliantly put. Perfect point to draw a line under this conversation. My thanks to you and to all my callers on this.